Salutations, everyone. Welcome back to Total War Pharaoh. This time, of course, with the Dynasties expansion. And we're going to be going over the Mycenae faction, also known as the Agamemnon faction. Of course, just be aware if you don't have the Immortal Generals on, or Immortal Faction Leaders, he will die at some point. So I'm going to refer to it as the Mycenae faction overall. I'm Lord Fornd, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this video up into several different segments so that you can jump to whatever section you'd like. We're going to go over starting situation, bonuses, weaknesses, what edicts to take, what court stuff you should deal with, what ancient legacy, stuff like that. So that should be timestamped below so you can jump to what you'd like. So let's get right into it. So Mycenae, the Lords of Men. So one of the biggest strengths for this faction is they get more resources the higher their influence. So their resource production buildings, and I'll look at this one, which they show here, is you get 170 food from the base building, but then if your influence is high, you will get an additional bonus. This applies to all your different resource buildings. It's really nice. On the downside, and the game does let you know this, you do have to have high influence to get full benefit from your provinces. Not a problem in your starting area in the South Achaia, or however you say it, southern part of Greece, modern day Greece. Everything there should have your influence anyway, but if you expand elsewhere into Anatolia Minor, modern day Turkey, or even down into Egypt in that area, you're going to have to build a lot of buildings that give you influence. It says you can stabilize a province more easily. I'm not the biggest supporter of that being called a strength. You do get a building here. This is the highest level of it. That does give you a high level of influence, happiness, and later on legitimacy and victory points. We'll go over that when we go over buildings. But you do have a decent influence building, which is, I guess, what they mean. Now, in terms of your faction units, you have a lot of high damage melee units. Your ranged units slightly shorter range. I didn't feel it affecting me too much, except when I fought the Trojan faction. Then it got a little bit harder. Units tend to be fairly quickly moving on the map, so it does give you good maneuverability. Honestly, though, it's not game shifting. It says you should focus on some of these units here, Mycenaean Raiders, which are worth focusing on early game. They are a very powerful axe unit. They do fall off a little bit or while fighting ranged units. They also recommend skirmish chariots. I didn't find this one particularly useful. Just because chariots are still a little wonky to use, but it does do decent damage. The range is a little bit short, but nothing's going to easily be able to catch them while they're peppering the enemies. In terms of your commands, Agamemnon has a really nice one here for Mycenae. If you click the button, once it's off cooldown, it starts on cooldown if you allow all features at the beginning of the game, which I have. You get a elite unit and an ancillary straight into your faction leader's army. The unit will get stronger as the game goes on and your faction leader levels up, but early on it tends to cost gold, and the one resource you are lacking at the beginning of the game is gold. It is fixable. I'll go over that later if I remember, but recruiting too many elite units at the beginning of the game can cause problems for you. If you don't use it, your construction times and cost of your main buildings, monuments, and monument outposts are cheaper, and they are faster to be built, especially the lower the civilization state is. So, ironically, Mycenae is, I won't say all right with having the civilization state super low, but it handles it better than some other factions. Obviously, not as much as the factions who do want to lower it, but it allows you to rebuild and actually, as you get to be a great empire, you can actually raise the civilization state pretty much on your own if things go well. Now, the last thing to note of his strengths and weaknesses the game tells you, there are some others. Your court requests don't cost court actions, and they only cost 40 regard. Let's take a look at the court. If you haven't seen it, I did do a court management guide. It should be part of the overall guide for Total War Pharaoh. But I go over it on Manage the Court, so we're not going to really go over it here. But you can, to make a request, you need 40 regard, so perform intrigue, gossip usually gain 10, or you can do like assist if you've got extra money, gain a lot, and then you can request stuff. Now, the stuff to request is unfortunately, in my opinion, not some of the best. Your threat and plot goes up. You improve your active plots. Not really that great. Over here, you can get embezzle. This one is actually more decent at the beginning of the game when you might lack gold. It will give you gold. It also can reduce building category cost. If you're expanding a lot, can be useful. If you're holding your own province, probably not worth focusing on. The Oracle over here, temple building is cheaper. Temple building usually isn't crushing your economy in my experience. Piety, gain extra favor with the gods. Can be kind of useful. Overall, not worth it. Over here, however, you can recruit elite units, which is quite nice. If you want to fill out your army with other elite units from different regions of the Aegean, can be quite useful, as well as reducing army cost. Now, your particular position that you start with, which is basically king of the Achaeans. It's not a direct translation. You get some elite units, which is quite nice. On top of your press a button, get a unit ability. Flanking maneuver ability for own army. Very useful if you can set up ambushes. And you can choose your army wages cost stuff. So, in fact, on your first turn, one of the things you should do is figure out where you want your discounts. In my experience, which it's mine, axe units and javelin units to start tend to be your best move. Spears, they shouldn't cripple your economy anyway, and you're not going to have melee chariots anyhow. So changing that will help you. It will apply and do other stuff. But making requests can be quite useful, especially if you need to raise an elite army. This position here isn't available at this moment. Usually Troy will occupy that in a few moments anyhow. So moving back to the faction summary, you have outposts. Obviously, everyone does. You get Shrine of Zeus, which is quite nice in the sense that it increases your influence and it makes it easier to build admin buildings. Praying at them will give you a nice morale boost. Morale boosts are not particularly common in this game, so any morale bonus is quite nice. You tend to worship Zeus. You have his cult center already. The prayer effect is morale. Native units, it's going to talk about some of this stuff. It really not a bonus, nothing else. Terrain and weather, it is important to note that you have rain and fog more than sweltering heat, so that fighting in vegetation, dry weather is great, but if you have trouble in deserts or sandstorms. In terms of your titles, and we'll go over that later, this statement that your titles grant bonuses to smaller armies, I'll explain that in a few minutes. It's not as huge of a key concept as the game is making it out to be. In terms of your dynasty, this is very weird. You have your Agamemnon is married with 2 children, a boy and a girl, which is great because you have an heir. However, Menelaus, his brother that we know of from the Iliad, isn't part of the family, which is just bizarre. I hope they fix it at some point. Royal traditions, you'll have access to 2 of them. I'll go over that in a minute. You start automatically in the Aegean royal tradition, so it's difficult to do other stuff. You want to become supreme ruler eventually. That's usually the goal of everybody. Once you do, as Agamemnon or Mycenae, you tend to be able to vassalize a lot of the minor Achaean factions. It's just a matter of overthrowing Troy, and trust me, Troy will not make it easy. So, that would be advantages, disadvantages, and key concepts. Okay, the next one we're going to go over is Ancient Legacies. So, I have chosen to allow this to be available at the start along with the court. Over time, normally this would unlock. I believe it's turn 8 or so you get access to these. You have 2 choices for the Aegean factions here. You can go Atreus, the first Wanax, known to those who've played, obviously, God of War recently, and Perseus the hero, who's better known to anybody. Now, the game strongly recommends that Mycenae go for Atreus, the first Wanax. If you do, you'll gain access to competing against enemy factions to gain Dominus, which is quite cool. It's quite strong. If you get enough Dominus, you can gain bonuses, swing diplomatic deals in your favor, etc. And you can give yourself, I think it's plus 50 legitimacy during a civil war, which is quite nice. Now, on the other hand, Perseus relies on alliances, grouping people together, defensive military alliances. It's basically custom made for Troy. However, and I don't want to point this out, Mycenae actually plays this legacy very well, in addition to playing the other legacy very well of Atreus. The reason I say it plays it well is because you actually have several allies. So really, you can go whichever you like. Traditionally, and the way the game wants you to do it, it wants you to go with Atreus, the first Wanax. So we will select this legacy here. So, current dominance we start with is 50, and you can see their options here. A threat they cannot fulfill, you can destroy court plots using your dominance. If you've got 100, you can gain a bonus to make demands, as well as deal evaluations. And if you have 200, you can get, I think it's plus 50 to your legitimacy in a civil war. Now, you're probably not going to be able to take over that position of supreme leader of the Aegean factions early on. Troy has a very high amount of legitimacy, and they will gain more. But let's look at how you get these objectives. So at the start of the game, you start off at war with the Corinthians. If you defeat their faction leader, you gain 50. You conquer their capital, you gain 15, etc., etc., etc. If you complete all the dominance objectives, you get a unique follower, which is kind of nice. So if we were to go here and we were to... oh, never mind. I'm forgetting how we actually do it. Nope. I can't show you that. But suffice to say, there would be a way to improve your diplomatic relations in a deal with them. I can't show it to you right now because we don't have enough. So, suffice to say, that's a good one if you're going to conquer a lot of stuff. The Perseus option is if you're going to remain allied to various factions and build up that way. It does give you a nice pool of a lot of units. Okay, I've actually figured out how to show you the dominance. I was on the wrong faction. There was only one option for diplomacy. Here, if you can see, we're negotiating with Ajax, who's got a really impressive, like, faux hawk or mohawk up there. If we do a non-aggression pact, then we have an option to spend dominance. It will add plus 25 to the success of the deal. That's where the button is. It's grayed out at the beginning. Other faction insufficiently weak is a thing, which is quite annoying. Just be aware, it doesn't work particularly well in diplomacy, which is where I was going with that. Court, on the other hand, make a demand. You can use dominance to get requests and stuff done. It's honestly not worth it to use dominance unless you need something urgently. It's not particularly useful. You can also stop court plots with that. And Power of the Crown, in a civil war, you can hit this and you'll gain 50 legitimacy. Now, it looks like we'd be able to pass Troy. Don't be fooled. Troy will grow very rapidly. Okay, the next one we're going to go over is Royal Decrees. I'm trying to do this in the order of things you would do at the start of the game, which is why we did, if you've got it unlocked, why we did the Royal Traditions Legacy, and then obviously Royal Decrees. So, interestingly enough, Mycenae starts with an unlocked Royal Decree. Legitimacy from battles plus 50. If the game hasn't made it really obvious by this point, you're meant to fight a lot of battles and get most of your legitimacy that way rather than necessarily conquering and building, which Troy specializes in more. This is a very nice one. You'll gain rapid legitimacy this way. However, I do want to point this out. It can fool you into thinking you can contest the crown. Just be aware, unless you're battling during the contestation for the crown, the legitimacy is going to go down, and it goes down a lot more rapidly than you might expect. So looking at the Royal Decree trees, you've got a couple choices to start. The first one here, it's by and large one of the better ones you can pick overall. Melee defense, damage resistant versus missiles. Always a solid one to pick to begin with. The other option here is good governance, cheaper construction times. The first goal of any faction in Total War Pharaoh, dynasties or not, is usually to get food. Food supports your base army, so what we're going to start with is going towards Fisherman's Tithe. Now, you could, if you wanted to, Shield by the Gods, Martial Nobility. If you're going to recruit more generals, this will be helpful. It'll also get you closer to an ambition choice slot. The downside is it's going to delay you getting extra food. If you go this way, good governance up, plus 15 food from all ports faction-wide, which is really nice. And then further on here, you can get missile range. Kind of counteracts the supposed short range you have as this faction. And then finally, diplomatic relations with all factions. You can choose relations with the Aegean, the Achaeans, Thracians, Phrygians, and Pelasgians. I can never say that one right. Same thing with the Egyptians and Hittites. If you want to play slightly more diplomatic, not a bad idea. Really getting the food thing is all you need from this position. If you want to get more food afterwards, if you don't want to go down this tree yet, which is understandable, you can instead jump over here to Life of Soldier, Promise of Glory. Replenishment after sacking or raising is always good. But most importantly, you have Depending on the Undependable. Additional food as the world gets further into crisis and collapse. Always a good thing. Stacking that combined with the food, very solid. So my recommendations personally, probably strength of good governance. You can build up and build really tall fairly quickly as Mycenae, and arguably that's your best starting strategy. So getting that done really helps. Then snagging Depending on the Undependable. You basically just want to be able to support a lot of armies if need be. And if you've got excess food, which this faction tends to have, you can then trade it for other resources you might need. On the other hand, you have access to basically all the resources except for gold at the start of the game, so it's less important. Other things to highlight in this tree, if we are struggling to get other resources, first off, +3 happiness in your capital is not really needed, but further down here, lavish feasts can be. You can do a hecatomb, boosting your relations with the gods, making it cheaper, making it last longer. The cooldown out kind of balances out the prayer duration. Can be quite useful if you use a lot of prayers. And again, over here, another god dedication slot. Very useful to have 2 rather than 1. You want to pick a god that either gives you resources, happiness, or Zeus gives you influence already. Further on, prayer duration up is very nice. Goes kind of along with the lavish feasts. And then finally, if you want to, Training Mandate Precision is a decent one to snag. Be aware that your missile infantry is not as strong as other factions, but it will help balance that out. These two together plus 30 range is quite useful. Other things to point out on the way here. These various relations here are quite nice. Stone income from when allied to the Aegean faction, I found particularly useful. Ally a minor Egyptian faction like Odysseia and Ithaca, and you get bonus stone income. And of course, stone is probably the most limiting resource in the game, so that's very useful. Now, down here on the bottom path, we're going to get into the strength of Mycenae. They consider it a strength. I don't like it. I think it needs some balancing, but here's one of the first ones. Specialized Expeditionary Forces. Plus 20% movement on land and plus 30% ambush chance only to armies with 10 units or fewer. The game is trying to encourage you, and it doesn't do a decent job in my opinion, is to encourage you to fight with multiple 10-unit armies. In fact, your starting armies, you have 2 starting armies unique. Both of them are below 10. So it's trying to incentivize you to have 2 10-man armies rather than 1 20-unit army. If you're using unique units, unique and elite units can be very useful. The additional movement speed is really powerful. The problem is you have to have extra generals. So you can either play around it, gain some bonuses that way, or honestly just ignore it entirely and you really won't notice a huge difference. Now, next to that, however, is one that makes the food upkeep 12% cheaper. Can be useful early on if you want to have some small garrison armies. It doesn't counteract the administrative burden increases as the game goes on. By the time you're using extremely unique elite units that have gold, you're probably not that concerned about food, so this becomes less useful. On the other hand, it does make maintaining your army cheaper. But those are the two major ones here they're going to give you to encourage you to use 10 units or less. There are other bonuses under titles that can give you more. I'll talk about that later. Now, the only other thing to think about over here is power of people. Income from all sources plus 20 in a province with max idle workforce. This is actually not hard to achieve, especially in your capital region of Mycenae. It already is fairly built up. If we jump over to it, you would see that it's already at tier 4. It's not that hard to get it to tier 5 in like the first 15-20 turns of the game. If you do, you get a huge boost to civilization points, which will delay the collapse of pillars of civilization to a good degree, as well as just make Mycenae massively powerful. And at some point, it's very easy to max out the workforce here. If you've already got decent growth towards it, having more quite easy on that front. In terms of other decrees that are worth looking at, Indomitable leadership is quite interesting if you've got high-ranked generals. There's a lot of focus on elite units and elite generals in this faction. Sculptors of Opinion is very important, though, I would say, for this faction, because you rely on high influence. So plus 5 influence to provinces with monuments, really handy once you start expanding outside of your core homeland and start dealing with other cultures. Plus 5 influence is massive, just to point that out. Resistance is futile, stacks with that. If you raise or sack outposts, you gain additional influence faction-wide, basically. Making subduing regions easier, as well as not necessarily the regions you're fighting at the moment, but the previous regions you've already conquered will help keep them loyal and heavily influenced towards your faction. Again, another general bonus down here. This one, of course, is the bronze version of the food one that we looked at earlier. Interestingly enough, this one gives you more bronze during prosperity and less during collapse. On the other hand, plus 5, plus 10 can be quite useful in the long run. Other things to note in the military tree. Experience from battles for native units, experience from battles from all units. Your units will rank up significantly faster. These are just decreases to building stuff. Up top here, faster military construction of outposts. Not that useful. The big one finally appears, mercantilism. Plus gold income for level 5 buildings. If you get it, it's a nice little source of gold without needing gold mine provinces. If you have a gold mine province, you're usually set on gold for a good chunk of the game anyhow. Less important than you might think. Over here we got another god dedication slot, which is nice. Cheaper recruitments when you ally to an Aegean faction can be useful for small garrison armies or cheap armies to fend off raiders and stuff. Since, as Mycenae, you should probably ally a couple of the minor Greek factions, can be useful as the game progresses. Honestly, though, it's a bigger bonus early game than it is late game, because this is 1, 2, and 3 tier units. Quite useful, though, to maintain stuff. Wisdom of Years, tier 3 units, cheaper upkeep, recruitment costs. Military Traditions, tier 4 units, getting into your elite stuff. Significantly cheaper recruitment costs and upkeep. This one, on the other hand, is worth it, and it does stack with the food decrease over there. So, big decrease in your upkeep costs if you want to for tier 4 and 5 units, basically. A little bit on tier 3. And then finally over here, recruitment costs cheaper under generals with large, high ranks and units that you can recruit to the armies. Can be quite useful. On the other hand, you shouldn't be losing your elite soldiers that much. The other one to note up here is the plus food. Plus stone, similar to the plus food or the plus bronze ones. If I had to make a list of the most powerful ones, since you're probably wondering about that right now, food from ports, Food from various, as the world gets worse. Ambition slot. If you want to do small armies, these over here. Otherwise, relations with everybody is never a bad thing. It'll just prevent people randomly declaring war on you a little bit more. So any of those relations are good. Over here, getting some of these bonuses towards influence once you expand out of your homeland is arguably essential. Snagging bronze and stone additions are great. And then once you get into the late game, these recruitment and upkeep costs are important. But early on, focus on over here. As the game progresses, go into this side. Left tends to be early game, right tends to be later game. And that is the royal decrees. Okay, I think we're finally ready to go over the starting situation. So the first thing I want you to do is hit the home key on your keyboard to realign the map to an actual normal orientation. I don't know why the game starts with the map as warped as it is, but this will give you a more accurate relation to the world than this, which would make Mycenae seem to be in the north when it's in fact more in the south. So hitting the home key on your keyboard will always zoom to your capital. It'll also fix the map. So let's look at how we start. So Mycenae, I think, is the largest starting faction that you can play that's not a minor faction. You start with 4 whole settlements. All the way down here in Cytheria, including Sparta. This is not the Spartans. This is predating them. For those of you wondering where the Spartans are, they won't be along for another 1,000 or more years. So quite a while. Then over here we've got Mycenae. By the way, if you've never seen the ruins of Mycenae, it's quite actually interesting to look at them because Agamemnon was the king there. That's one of the few historical people we actually have an idea that existed in the Iliad. So Mycenae and Tiryns over here are part of one region, Sparta and the other are over here. The downside is you don't own your full provinces. Laconic Wit, the Spartish Wit, and then Achaea up here, which is the northern half of this area. So combining those two is what you want to do early game. You start at war with Corinth. Corinth is annoyingly hard to finish off. They only own one province, so once you do, you control the area. It is important to note that conquering Corinth will put you near Athens, which tends to be very aggressive in my experience. Taking Athens I found easy. Holding Athens was a little bit harder because it's rather exposed to both the sea and the north. Corinth, on the other hand, far more defensible. Everything kind of has to march through here. The Isthmus of Corinth. Great choke point militarily. So, first things to think about, and you're probably wondering why I haven't gotten to it, is conquering Corinth. Well, here are your 2 generals, Menelaus and Agamemnon, and Menelaus is, of course, still not part of the ruling family, which is just bizarre. The game is trying to encourage you to use 10 unit or less armies. Unfortunately for the game, I'm going to turn down the background talking. The bonuses are not kicking in at the beginning of the game, so freely ignore the 10 units or less restriction. What you're going to want to do is make sure that your troops are nearby, take Agamemnon, attack this army. You can win this without more casualties if you actually fight it. Be aware though, you're fighting with militia units. He actually has some military units. This is not the world's easiest fight. You do want to win this fight. Usually Cadmean victory is enough. So if we were to win it, the next thing you want to do though is replenish your army. Now you would think this is go to Corinth. You don't want to go to Corinth. Taking Corinth is nigh on impossible at this point. What you want to do is actually retreat. Now, you could merge the armies together if you wanted to. I would recommend sending Menelaus south to Tiryns and take Agamemnon and march him actually south into the Spartan region. The reason we're doing this, and this was the result of many tests by me, unless you can win the first battle with almost no casualties and take Corinth with almost no casualties, you're not going to be able to finish off the Corinthians very easily. If you don't put an army in Tiryns and you retreat to Mycenae, for example, Tiryns will be sacked by this army. He can actually reach it. The distance these armies move here is huge. Don't underestimate how far armies march in Greece. For some reason, it feels like they almost forgot terrain slowing down, because you can go from like Athens to Sparta in a turn and a half. Even more once you get outposts that allow additional movement range. In Tiryns here, you will want to recruit some units. You'll notice you're stuck with the very, very basic, almost militia units. That's fine. You just want some more troops at this point. On the other hand, Sparta has a military recruitment building, unlike Mycenae. Now, this is where you get to choose where you want to recruit units. My recommendation is don't build military buildings in Mycenae. Seems a little stupid. On the other hand, if you turn Mycenae into a resource production area, you will note here that you have food, bronze, stone, and gold all in the same province region, meaning you want to build this up to get the most percent resources possible out of this area, and it will be very profitable for you. Sparta, on the other hand, does not have gold. It has 2 foods, a bronze, and a stone. Cytherea here is, in my opinion, probably the most sacked settlement in any game I've played in Total War. All the sea people will target that, as well as other factions I found. Which means building an army center in Sparta is not a bad idea. You start with 1. You can easily start installing additional recruitment ranks, recruitment slots, etc. You can build them here. Mycenae, on the other hand, does have a unique landmark building, the Cyclopean Walls, which you don't really want to build unless you want their elite palace guards. But you also have the Grand Temple of Zeus, meaning if you want to build those, you're already down 2 slots, meaning you only have 3 building slots in Mycenae. If you want to do a garrison, which I highly recommend, then you're down to 2, and you still can support at least wood and food, let alone other options elsewhere. You could get some temples. Thus, my argument is don't build military buildings in Mycenae. Okay? Hopefully I've convinced you of that. Focus them in Sparta. Regardless, on your first turn here, you want to have Agamemnon in Sparta so you can actually recruit some decent units. Which ones to recruit? A little bit up to you. In my experience, you're going to be fighting people with spears in Corinth. So having clubs is a little bit more useful since they have better melee attack. They have insignificantly better melee defense. Low lethality though, which can hurt. So maybe 2 units of them. If you want bowmans, this is where you could start getting some archers. If you've left on lethality, which of course is a customizable option at the beginning of the game, bowmen and slingers are fairly decent if you flank. Otherwise, you want to avoid low lethality units like this one. If possible, they're good for holding the line. They won't get a lot of kills. 2 island club warriors is good. The other thing you can do is you can go over here and you can recruit Wanax's retinue, Guerrilla Stalkers, very powerful unit. Paragon Swordsman, you can't afford at the point. The only thing I want to point out is these cost gold, and you only have 220 and you're losing 35 a turn. You can buy gold from other factions to support this, and if you do, a Wanax retinue, 2-handed axeman, good versus missiles, very high lethality is, in my opinion, the better buy here. But do be aware if you do, you're going to run out of gold in like 2 turns. So you have to trade for gold. If you want to do that, good. If not, just build up the starting units you have. Once you get both of these armies up a bit, he's going to sit in Corinth. Corinth has a garrison of 8. They may upgrade it to the next level where they'll have 10. In which case they'll also have about 20 units or so in their army. So you got to overcome 20 or 30 units, 15 at least in both. Arguably, you want to be more towards a full 40. If you do, Corinth falls easily. Now, once you've taken Corinth, or if you're still in the process of taking Corinth, things in the world may change. I've played a couple campaigns as these guys. In my experience, the biggest threat outside of Corinth is Crete. specifically, I think Knossos, which is the largest one in Crete, they tend to invade you. And what they're invading for is Cytheria, meaning you'll have to have an army there to defend it. Cytheria is a really nice province. Food, stone, definitely going to want to throw a garrison building down there. Has no walls. Sea people and other factions seem to love targeting it. So as the game went on, I basically had to station a decent army, not just full of militia units, a solid army in Cytheria to prevent it from being constantly raised. It's annoying. On the other hand, if you hold it and you have troops there, enemies tend to ignore Sparta and Mycenae entirely and focus down there. Every war I fought in Greece seemed to have everything targeting this province. Maybe it's a glitch. I don't know. If it gets fixed, it would be really nice. So that's also another good reason to have Sparta be your military center. You can recruit the units to fight down there. Very useful. Let's assume you're holding Cytheria here, got a garrison, or you haven't yet been attacked there. Corinth has fallen. Where to go next? Well, you have a few options. My recommendation is take Aegeon up here, get the gold mine, cement your full control of a province, then you can issue commandments. By and large, the one that gives you 5% more resources is the best one, since you have access to all the resources. Build them up, fortify them. Aegeon up here is fairly vulnerable, so you're probably going to want to station your other army up there, and you're going to want at least 2 armies. Now, once you attack Aegeon up here, you'll also be at war with the people of Altis. Pylos down here is just a matter of sending 2 armies. Now, be aware, in my experience, Pylos tends to have a decent army because they have access to both bronze and a decent amount of food, plus the AI cheats. Even at normal levels, Pylos had a full stack and a half, meaning it took quite an effort to finish them off. Hopefully that gets balanced in the future, but I find it unlikely. In which case, both armies crush these guys. They don't tend to ally other people. If they do, they tend to ally one of these minor settlements on either side of Ithaca. Odysseus' capital right here. You start off with, I believe, a non-aggression pact, as well as a barter agreement with them. So you're getting some gold, you're getting some stone from various people. Try and keep these guys roughly as allies. The Arcadians over here are great to get you gold early on. Afterwards, though, you want it yourself. On the other hand, Ithaca doesn't get you much of anything. Food, bronze, stone, and its water. If you ally Odysseus, that's great. You may have to conquer the other areas. I personally conquered them, gave them to Odysseus' faction, and I had a fairly solid ally for the rest of the game. You could take it yourself. Be aware, though, this is a very long coastline to defend until the Sea People invasions kind of slow down or stop. Obviously, it's been changed slightly in Total War Pharaoh dynasties, but naval invaders are still your biggest threat. On the other hand, if you don't want to conquer this area, which honestly, why wouldn't you? You want gold, you want stone, more copper, always good. The next option is targeting Athens. Athens declared war on me in 4 out of 5 of my test campaigns. They only own a single province. I marched in, conquered them. It was fairly effortless. To the north is other factions like Ajax and Achilles, who tend to like you. You can try and maintain alliances with them. You could try and conquer them. However, by that point of subduing this area or Athens, you're probably getting to the point where you want to fight a civil war against Troy. If you don't expand any further to the east, remember Troy is way over here. Declaring war on them, I didn't see them in the first 2 civil wars in one of my campaigns. The third one, they had finally conquered enough islands they got to my lands during the Civil War. There is no huge Iliad war in this game. Really, I mean, it's set up that way, but there's no specific unique events and occurrences. In fact, Helen is at your court, and you can marry her off to Troy if for some reason you want to, rather than her being allied married to Menelaus. I don't know why that's a thing. Hopefully they fix it. I doubt they will. After you subdued this area, the next obvious target, unless you're going to ally them, is to take the Ithaca Odysseus area and then work on this coastline, mainly because there's no enemies to your left other than randomly spawning people who may cause trouble over there. Didn't in my games. Naxos and these island, the Cyclades, are the next place to go. Send 2. Honestly, you could probably support 3 armies at that point. Just overrun them. Some of them will be raised in sacks by various sea people invasions, etc. You could also take a journey down here to take Crete. Crete falls fairly easily in my experience. Do remembering you have these waters that you can sail significantly faster in. Can be quite useful for shooting around the map. Crete is a great one to take because all your sea routes kind of lead through Crete rather than up along the coast towards Athens. On the other hand, if you've got Athens over here, it's a very short hop, skip, and a jump to Anatolia Minor. Then if you want, you can fight the Trojans. By that point, if you can fight the Trojans and beat the Trojans, starting your armies in the islands, that way you don't have to sail this whole distance, you'll probably become king, and then the world's your oyster. It's very easy to vassalize some of these minor ones, especially if you went Atreus and you've got dominance. You can pretty much demand their submission and they will submit. I kind of miss the bonuses from Troy Total War where you got tribute from them, but overall it's still nice. Now, that is the starting situation and expansion paths. Let's talk about building and units, the fun stuff that everyone kind of hates but also enjoys. So in Mycenae, obviously we've talked about you probably don't want to build military buildings. However, there are some other buildings you might want to consider throwing down here. One of the first ones you could do is olive groves. It's not the world's greatest building, but it will give you both happiness, food, and workforce growth early game. It's fairly cheap. You can build it on turn 1. I recommend probably doing this, and then if you want, you can destroy it later, but it will help at the early game with the food and the happiness so that you don't have to worry as much about wars. Obviously, the higher happiness you have, the better workforce growth, etc. You don't have to worry about happiness too much because you have the Grand Temple of Zeus, +5 happiness in this area. Cheaper upkeeps for armies in this province, meaning once you've recruited the armies in Sparta, if you're not using them, stick them up in the Mycenaean area, and they will be cheaper to maintain. Other options to build here, you could throw down a livestock pastures. Note that you do not get a high influence bonus from this. That's only on your farms as well as your wood, meaning this livestock pens is actually less useful than you might imagine. It's almost, oops, let me pull this up here. That's 190. Over here, it's 115, and you don't have to upgrade it again. So in my opinion, you're probably better off with the olive groves rather than your livestock pastures. However, it is probably worth throwing down a woodworker here to make sure that you have slightly better wood income than what you start with. You could easily do that turn 1 as well. Other things to consider. Let's actually just pull up the building browser. It's easier to show you guys here. You already have the Grand Temple of Zeus. Can be worth building another Temple of Zeus here. You get favor, legitimacy, and even further reduced upkeep, happiness, and production of all resources. We've already talked about the fact that Achaea is a resource producing powerhouse. This helps as well. Plus, then you never have to worry about upkeep and happiness in this area. I wouldn't necessarily build it early, but it can be worth doing. Other things to consider, you could build some of these buildings over here. You do get a high influence bonus from them. The downside here is you lose happiness, as well as the fact that you're probably not going to be recruiting armies, and you have no specific areas that are entirely dedicated to one resource. I believe Aegean counts as a port city, so you also have a food fishing grounds there. It's not the world's greatest building, the fishing grounds. Let's jump to that. It doesn't give you a high income bonus, sadly. Only your base resource building does. But it's more food. So if you want, you could build a food building in Mycenae. I would recommend avoiding it though. So probably wood, maybe the temple. Olive groves early on, if you want, this should probably be your starting building. At some point, you'll want to throw down a garrison there. Happiness, holdout, morale. Always a good thing, so you don't have to worry about some faction sniping your capital. Adding that in there, it's like 15. Plus, if you've upgraded Mycenae all the way, you'd have even more troops up there. You'd have 12 plus the 5 there. 17, full garrison. Nothing's going to take Mycenae by siege, basically. Other things to consider here. I would avoid any of the military support buildings, training grounds, or recruitment, and focus more on management. You have a unique building here, road administration infrastructure buildings. It's unique to you. It's mentioned in your special buildings. Movement on land up, high influence, movement on lands up. If you've got an army here, your troops will just rocket around Greece. Could be quite useful because it's a fairly centralized one. It allows you to fight up north and then race south to fight off sea people or vice versa. If you want to, it's a great building. Doesn't get you any resources early game other than decreasing construction cost. So figure out when you want to build it. Honestly, outpost costs are not that excessive, and the province shouldn't be sacked that much. You have this building here, starting with the Cameus Council, going up to the Legacies Palace. I'm probably saying that all wrong. My apologies to any people who speak this language better than me. Happiness, influence, legitimacy, and victory points. Don't build this in your capital. You already have max influence, which is the big bonus of this. For legitimacy isn't worth filling up a building slot. Other things you can look at over here, Artisan Workshop. If you really want some happiness, spreads it to neighboring areas. You don't need to. Other things you should do, though, is this Royal Tax Administration, +3 happiness. If you've taken olive groves, if you've built another temple, happiness is not a problem, meaning you can afford +20 resources. Obviously, upgrade to max here. If you wish to, you can do Hall of Records, which has a high influence bonus on adjacent provinces. Not that useful here, but again, legitimacy as well as a production bonus can be useful. Translators' quarters, if you want diplomatic relations, great. You shouldn't need the happiness, construction cost, or construction time. So my recommendations, start with olive groves, snag at least the wood, the Temple of Zeus, so that's 3 buildings. So we have 2 left here. Garrison, that's 4. You have 1 building left. You can either pick movement, additional resources, or if you really want some 1 victory point and the extremely elite Palace Guard unit, which you can get away without using, but it's a very strong unit, Cyclopean Walls. That's Mycenae. In Tyrian over here, on the other hand, you've already started off with bronze and fishing grounds. The next thing you want to do over here, if you're concerned about the world collapsing, is get the Smuggler's Market, meaning you have to upgrade to level 3. If you don't want to lose the Smuggler's Market, which is fair because you have administrative burden on happiness and influence, you're going to want to stick either a garrison building here, guard tower, so it doesn't get sacked because it's on the coast, or my personal favorite, bronze proving hall, get 10% more bronze. Either of these two are always good. If you want to get a ton more food, Smuggler's Market. The downside is the struggle of maintaining things. Don't worry about these other buildings over here. They're useless. Sparta, the military recruitment center of your empire, probably. So if we look at Sparta, first off to note, there are no unique buildings in Sparta. You could build the temple. I really would avoid a temple here. You have a woodworker, which you'll want to snag for the additional wood income. Upgrading it does virtually nothing. It gives you 10 more at the cost of a lot of other stuff. If you've got excess resources, by all means do it. But wood buildings are the worst upgrade buildings in the game. You could also get livestock pens if you wanted to. But if we're going to make this a military center, we've got to focus on it. So we lose 1 building, 2 woodworkers, and we already have 1 for food. You want to keep the food for sure. So that's 4 buildings we have left to stick in here. We already have 1 military building. If you want, you could build training grounds to 3. These are going to be your 2 major construction military training buildings, so that's useful. So that leaves you 1 down. So now we're down to 3, I think. You want to snag proving grounds, recruitment rank, and recruitment slots so you can build armies rapidly down to 2. This is where you have to decide what else you want to stick in this area. If you want to use target yards, get some archers as well as javelins, down to 1. The Achaean javelins are really nice, so it's probably worth doing. I personally don't like chariots, but if you want to, here's your chariots, and that would fill out all your building slots. If you don't want to do that, I recommend throwing a city guard station in there so you never have to worry about the province being taken by siege. If you're not worried about that, you could build a Monument of Greatness. Huge bonuses towards legitimacy, happiness, influence, gold, upkeep cost, victory points, etc. You can only build one per faction. It's probably not necessarily worth building it in Sparta. You're probably going to build it elsewhere once you can afford it, in which case you could snag olive groves if you're concerned about happiness. Be aware, Cytheria will probably be sacked a fair amount, so happiness may be a concern, in which case throwing down olive groves in Sparta and maybe even justifiably snagging another happiness building as well. The guard station helps a little bit with that as well, but you could Temple of Zeus. I wouldn't recommend it though. Throw down an outpost in Sparta, Temple of Zeus, 5 happiness, problem solved. Now, in terms of outposts, every single region with a resource building should have a yellow economic Aegean trade post. 10% extra production of all resources. To start, you probably want it on both your stone, your gold, bronze, and then food, but you're going to want it everywhere. If you're concerned about areas being attacked like Tyrans, a decent building I found to throw down here is either a military outpost. A warrior's refuge costs food, but you will have XP per turn, random recruit replenishment, and random units joining the garrison. You could also build an Aegean fort and stick some units in there. I found the AIs like invading through here, especially the Cretians, making it quite useful. Aegean lookout fort is not bad. It's just likely to be taken a lot. Cytheria down here, you're going to want military buildings. Aegean fort can really help holding Cytheria. Stick a bunch of a general in there with some decent units. They will reinforce Cytheria during sieges. Quite useful. A warrior's refuge somewhere else. Just be aware of where you're sticking it. Sticking it right on the coast is just asking it for be taken. But if you stick it in these upper ones, less likely to be sacked. Again, that might be the only area, Cytheria, where you could consider not building a economic building, instead a fort, a warrior's refuge, and a lookout. The only reason we definitely have to build a lookout at some point is because this one refunds movement range. These two do not. You could also do it with an economic outpost to refund it as well, but the Aegean lookout post at least has a garrison, so it's going to be harder to take. The goal is to make it so that you can go from Mycenae to Cytheria in basically one turn. Will make it much easier to maintain that area. Okay, let's talk about units. Let's pull up the units. So, for the native units for Kia, and they've got a very nice way for you to look at it here. You have a lot of various options. Your low-level units are not that great. These young spears, they're not going to kill much. Similar things with your slingers. On the other hand, slingers have good range, and if you flank with them, they can do damage. Honestly, though, young spears and slingers are to fill out your armies. You want to start moving towards your more unique elite units. Armored slingers, significantly better. Shielded spearmen, great hold the line unit. Axemen, solid for attacking. Argive axemen, once you can get into these are level 4. These guys are absolute monsters. They will go right through shielded units. Spearmen, this is how you kill spearmen. These type of axemen, very powerful. If we look elsewhere, faction units here, where are we? Oh, Doesn't, oh, there we go. Agamemnon regulars. Mycenae Raiders. This is a very good unit. The game does actually recommend it at the beginning, and I agree. It's a high lethality unit if you've allowed it. It goes right through shielded units. Got a decent amount of armor, and it's got good melee attack, and it's fairly cheap to maintain, only costing food. Will be one of the backbones of your army early on. So if we look at the military buildings over here, I'm going to do it this way, actually. The first level training grounds here. Oh, bother, I didn't mean to do that. Will get you access to the Mycenae and militia unit. It's a terrible unit. It's only useful just to fill out your ranks. However, military camp level 2 is where you get the Mycenaean Raiders. Once you get that, you're probably never going to really want to build these guys unless you're dealing with units shooting at you, in which case these guys prove to be a little bit more defensive. Level 3, armory, armored axemen, significant improvement on the units. The difference being between the armored axemen and the Mycenaean Raiders is these guys are two-handed. They're going to go and kill significantly more units faster than your armored axemen. Both are lethal. The other one's high lethality. If you flank with the Mycenaean Raider, you're going to kill things fairly quickly. You're going to get some rounds. Heavy shielded spearmen, great for holding the line, good for nothing else. Unless for some reason you're concerned about holding and deflecting charges, in which case they are slightly better. Do note you have a G in bronze work, so this armor takes a lot longer to go down. Royal Barracks here. This is where you get your elite Mycenaean raid axemen. It's an upgrade from the radars. Very powerful, very useful. Does cost bronze to maintain, but overall just food and bronze for what's basically an elite top line unit. Very worth it. Once you get this, basically replace your Mycenaean Raiders with this unit. And finally at the top here, obviously you get to your superior units, renowned axemen and armored spearmen. Both are level 5, both cost gold to maintain. I would avoid the armored spearmen unless you really need an elite hold the line, kill nothing unit. These guys will get a little bit more kills in the lower ranks, but they're still not as useful as axemen units, which will just go right through enemies. Now, I'm a big fan of two-handed axemen over single-handed axemen. However, renowned axemen is a bit of an exception. With the shields, they are the perfect counter for something like Troy, who tends to build a lot of range units. They have advancing. Make sure you use these stances, by the way. Shield wall, missile parry up, severely powerful. Give ground, melee defense, very useful if you have to do a retreat. They have bonuses to flanking attacks, and they can hide in forests. Very useful. The native muster field here gives you your bowmen, your basic spearmen, and your club warriors. All fairly bad. Archers are okay. Further up here, the runners. Still, it's a scouting unit, which is kind of weird. Spot enemies. It's got a decent range. Sword and shields. It's kind of an interesting that you get 2 ammunition. Honestly, though, I didn't find a great use for it. Sword and shields. You've got better units in the axemen. Hillman, two-handed club infantry, high lethality, doesn't have a great bonus versus shields, but it does pierce armor. So if you're fighting a heavily armored opponent, like another Achaean, and they've got armored axemen or something, clubmen make a difference there, but otherwise, ignore them. If you, for example, are fighting the Egyptians, they don't have super heavy armored units for most of the game, so you don't need it. Now you get some of your javelin men here. These javelin men's high missile lethality. You flank and fire from behind. If you've ever played Total War Hammer 1, 2, or 3, and you've used gunners from the flank, think of these guys as gunners from the flank. They are absolutely devastating if you can throw the javelins into the enemy back. Not particularly great head-on. Bonus versus large, if you're fighting chariots or other units, they're useful against that. And they do pierce armor, which is nice. Over here, renowned armored slingers. If for some reason you're going to try and fight a ranged duel against somebody, these are going to be one of your better units. Honestly, though, you're going to lose a lot of ranged battles. You do have shields, so these guys are strong at killing archers, which of course have no shields, usually. On the other hand, they will get outranged by several archers. They can't really fight in melee. They do have this mixed shot, which is important to use arcing or direct shots. If you're shooting from behind, you'll do direct shots, and it's extremely powerful. Arcing, good against archers, though. Let's see, where were we? Then you can also get chariots here without having to build a chariot building. Just pointing that out, meaning that this is half decent. Native recruitment centers, Argive Axemen. It's similar to your other Axemen you can get elsewhere, but I prefer the other ones. Two-handed is usually better than one-handed. Shielded Spearmen, not a huge need, and then morale on recruitment and recruitment rank for native units. This is great. Native units you're going to want to build in your homeland. Outside of that, you're going to start getting other faction units, and your main barracks line here will be more useful. In terms of your target yard, this is where you can get some cheap javelins, high missile lethality, scouting. They're decent, not the world's strongest ones. But over here is where you get your bows of Mycenae. Your best archer unit. It's still not a great archer unit. I personally found slingers still to be more useful in the long run. But you get your javelin skirmishers as well, which again, flanking. Over here, if you want chariots and you don't go the left tree there and get those chariots, here's your javelin ones, which the game recommends. I cannot heavily recommend unless you're fighting on really flat terrain where you can ride in circles and shoot from behind. But the AI in particular is good at blocking them, and I can only imagine a human player will manage to turn their units to fend off javelins even better. Chariot assembly, heavy spear chariot. Chariots have gotten a little bit better, but you're an infantry faction. If you want to bring chariots, bring them, but you don't have the world's best chariots either. And that's pretty much the summary of your units. Of course, don't forget that you have your special recruitments. Your Paragon swordsmen are extremely powerful. They have a unique trait which I like, which is which have these unique trait called underdog. If you're in melee and there are fewer than 2 enemy units in range, it's disabled. But if there are more than 2 enemy units in range, they get a bonus to morale, melee defense, and attacked. So this is where the Mycenaeans' small, powerful armies start to come into play. A couple of these units will absolutely devastate enemies. It ignores armor, flanking attacks. It's immune to psychology, which is great. It does have a couple, I assume they're throwing javelins. Can't remember. A couple ammunition that does good damage anyhow. And of course, they have the various stances that are worth using. If you're going to use the Mycenaean small elite army, supposed strength the game gives you, you're going to want a lot of these units. All the other ones from the barracks, only the high level ones are going to be specifically useful. This unit right here, Guerrilla Stalkers, basically is going to be better than any other range unit you can recruit outside of maybe Armored Slingers for duels. This stuff, if you attack from behind with these guys, they are going to absolutely massacre enemy units. They have a very short range, very low ammunition, but they do a huge amount of damage. It's really powerful. They have serrated edges, so they lower morale as well. And they count as an underdog if they get caught in combat. They are unspottable. They can fire while hidden, vanguard deployment, and they can have armor breakers. Flanks galore. I imagine multiplayer, if this game ever develops a huge multiplayer, these units may have to be banned because they're that annoying. And again, Wanax Retinue, very early game, elite two-handed axe unit. Right here, core of your armies as the game progresses. Just be aware it does cost time to get these recruitments. If you click here, you can get some as well. You will have the ability to get them periodically. Do be aware, of course, every single unit you train basically gives administration cost. So small elite armies are still going to cost as much as large cheap armies. And unfortunately, there's no good way of handling administrative at this point. I really wish the game would have an option, build some buildings. It doesn't. Hopefully it gets changed. It probably never will. Taking just Mycenae, for example, it will get you easily up to tier 3 or even 4. So just be aware that you're going to be looking at a upkeep of at least 700 food, 50 copper. Just with the starting units, it's going to be even more. It's a big reason you want to get Mycenae fully developed to getting resources and stuff, because the cost is excessive. It's also a good incentive for you to use vassals rather than conquering everything yourself. But to do that, you have to become High King of the Aegean factions, which involves taking out Troy. Troy itself is hard to take, but once you can cross the ocean with 2 or 3 units, they fall as fast as every other AI faction does. Anyway, we have 1 or 2 last minor things to cover, and then we'll be done. Titles is important to go over because this is where you get some of the 10 unit or less bonuses again. At the start of the game, you're going to want to put a lot into Fortitude, the green line, for the replenishment. I'm always a advocate for replenishment basically anywhere you can get it, because replenishment is so strong early game. It allows you to fight battles and actually take settlements rather than fighting battles, having to wait 5 or 6 turns as your army replenishes and then have to fight another same size army you just defeated. Getting to level 5 also gets you melee defense. Once you get to level 5 here, it's probably worth getting level 5 on the blue line, Ardor, so you get the additional movement as well as a charge bonus. Level 5 up here, influence, upkeep, line of sight. It's good as you start using more elite units, specifically if you're going to go for the 10 unit or less strategy. Red line becomes even more important here if you fill this all the way up. Prevent rebellions is nice. Upkeep -20. If you remember, we had another 12 from tech, another 12 on that for food. You could have your elite units like 50 or almost 50% cheaper maintenance of food and 30 or so on other units. Very useful to making small, powerful, cheap armies. But honestly, I still like the larger army strategies myself. Further up here, more melee defense. Fatigue buildup is a big thing for melee units. However, these factions have ways around that. So at the beginning, let's just go with the beginning. You have choices here of what you want to take. I personally like the tireless in battle. If no enemy presence is in close range, your units replenish stamina, meaning you can position better. However, if you want more money, Prudent Victory is always a decent start. Even just for the first turn, toss it on there. Take it off on another turn, toss on another one. You can get extra resources from the first battles. Hit them hard is good if you're going to personally fight the battles, otherwise less useful. Just be aware if you've left on lethality and you're fighting battles, it's far too easy for your generals to be killed if you don't have immortal generals. Further on, what are we going to do? Master Bronze Worker is another 10 armies or fewer. Good for small elite armies, not good for larger ones. The next one down here, Strategist of Specialized Forays, plus 30 movement and ambush chance on armies with 10 or fewer. It does stack very nicely with the Royal Decrees over here of plus 20. So basically units can move 50% further than if, say, in Mycenae, you've built this unit or this building, which gives an additional 20 or even 40 more. You can start to see why I said this faction moves around the map very quickly. Of course, that does rely on small elite armies. So there are advantages to it. On the other side, you really need elite units. Resources from ransoming. I've never really felt that ransoming resources made a lot, even in this game. Movement restored after battles is very useful. Overseer of Carousing, significantly stronger than you would imagine, especially with your other movement bonuses. You fight a battle, you can chase them down or take a settlement. Definitely worth snagging if you get to 8 on the blue line. Enticing Promise, if you're going to fight a lot of battles, is definitely worth it, especially if you're going for that small elite army thing, because this is a red and this is another red right here. So those two together are very useful. If you're raiding a lot, which you really shouldn't need to be raiding a lot, raiding has still never been fixed in the Total War games. You can do it for no movement penalty, move and raid. Useful if you're needing to support your wars or just in general keep your attrition immunity from bankruptcy down. Just pointing that one out. That's a nice little trick there to avoid losing units to bankruptcy. Obviously, this is great for movement if you've got a 10 or less army. Lion-like Wrath, though, is a general one. XP, rating, income, and influence. Very useful if you're trying to convert. I'm going to call it converting, influencing settlements that you've just taken, especially with your faction leader. Further down here, Beloved by Zeus, +2 relations with all factions is no joke, especially maintaining and keeping vassals once you become Great King. As well as attack and missile damage. Very useful. Regal Presence, another influence one. If you stack it with this one, you're basically going to influence an entire region in a handful of turns. Very useful for a faction that relies on high influence. Just be aware you'll still have to build the buildings once the guy leaves. Overseers of Sieges, honestly, just forget about it. It's not worth it. I've never sieged an enemy holdout in this game in all my campaigns. Just bring another army and take the city. Over here, prudent scavenging, replenishment, but you lose movement. Don't ever take it. It's not worth it. It's only 8 replenishment. If you've gone up to here, you're up to 15 replenishment. It's just, I don't even know why this is an option this late at the game. And then the last one, relishes with Incarnage. Increase replenishment from Take Them On, Battle Loot, and Charge. If you've gotten him to 9 on all stats, can be worth snagging just to get the increased replenishment. And that is the last title. So as you can see, there are a couple cheaper bronze. Where's the other one? Increased movement, 10 or less. You can get a huge discount on units. Honestly, though, you can also just play it as if those techs never existed, and it's just like every other faction. In terms of acquired or unacquired traits, what you should focus on, is ending your turns in encampment stance, +15 replenishment if it's maxed out. Even at low levels, 4 or 8, very handy. I think that's the big one to focus on there. I don't remember any other ones to be particularly useful. If you're going rating, you can do that again there. Influence. Settlements with low happiness will get you influence. Settlements with high happiness gets you more happiness. Again, stuff to convert lands. Morale, object size, aura size is kind of useless. Anyway, I think that's basically everything we've gone over with. Power of the Crown, you're going to want, about 130, 140 to have a chance of taking out Troy. The 69 will very quickly jump up to 80 and 90, and they can easily increase their legitimacy by 30 or 40. Don't forget about legitimacy support if you can get it from a faction, which is no guarantee, but you could demand X amount of legitimacy and pay for it, or even threaten for it. Can help. Be aware they will try and do the same thing. Your best bet is by and large invading them during the Civil War rather than hoping to have more legitimacy at the end of a Civil War. Once you do that, vassalize everybody, go nuts. Other couple quick things to cover. The ruling family tree here, dynasty, changes once you become a great king, and you can actually get, legacy stuff. Up until that point, you don't have that option. Just for people who I know we're going to ask. In terms of local deities, let's just hit this because it's worth hitting. Zeus, happiness is always good, making Zeus a very, very good god for the early game. Here's where you would click to do a hecatomb, which will activate prayer to Zeus for all the turns, which is morale and reduce fatigue buildup. If you level up the tier, it will do more. 18 morale, 20% fatigue buildup, increased happiness. All good stuff. Now, oddly enough, and kind of annoying, Zeus gives bonuses to missile damage, and you're not a great missile faction. So it could be better. The increased aura size is nice. Honestly, though, it's just you take it for the happiness and the morale, nothing else. In terms of other Greek Aegean gods, there you have Poseidon, which gives speed and battle loot, as well as influence, wood, and food. Not bad to snag once you've got a couple more slots, especially if you want to influence lands. Between a Poseidon and a Zeus shrine in a whole province, that province is going to be both loyal and by and large converted to influence. Especially if you stack it to tier 3, huge bonus, as well as build monuments from the royal decree to influence happiness as well. Aries, kind of disappointing to some degree. Cheaper recruitment in a region. If you've got it, throw it down and say like Sparta, cheaper to recruit them. If you do a prayer, they get a huge charge bonus and a good amount of lethal melee lethality. It makes the two-handed axeman even more dangerous. The devoted general gets to recruit more units and enemies have fewer morale. It's okay. The shrines, other than the recruitment costs and some of the influence, not particularly great for a war god, in my opinion. Apollo, which you do not worship, your royal tradition's patron deity, which is Trojan, ammunition and ranged lethality. So just expect, if you fight the Trojans, to be fighting a lot of very powerful archers. There's no reason you should take this as Mycenae. There just is none. And the last one is Aphrodite. Food recruitment cost, 40%. Honestly, food is forgettable. Workforce growth, if you're struggling to build up a region, it's great. Otherwise, ignore it. Captive taken, forget it. Happiness for this province with a general, not worth it. The devoted general for the replenishment rate is pretty good, as well as the morale. It's like a better version of Zeus for a general. Can be worth taking. By and large, though, Zeus, Poseidon, those are your two best ones to go with. Oh, it is worth pointing out that on the first turn of the game, you can devote a general. Just devote Agamemnon or Menelaus, one or the other, whichever you're going to use for fighting. If you don't want to risk Agamemnon, just use Menelaus. There's no consequences to his dying. Much safer to use, and since you start with him, just use him. The only difference is he doesn't get some of the unique weapons that Agamemnon starts with. He starts with his own. They're just not as particularly good. He's a much safer general to use. He does start, however, with slightly less competencies. So Agamemnon is the better general at the beginning, even at level 1. It's up to you if you risk him. But regardless, whoever you're going to use to fight the most, dedicate them to the gods. Other minor things to point out here is you start off with the builder's wages, which makes resource production and economic buildings cheaper on the first turn. So definitely do your construction when you can. Recruitment, cheaper for 2 turns. Axe and javelin units, focus on those. I think that's mainly the faction effects you have. You can always check, by the way, by going to the faction summary and see what you have. You have a bonus to its bronze, food, and wood for 12 turns. Just be aware, especially here, 20. So after 20 turns, you're going to guaranteed lose 650 food income. So just be aware of that because it can be a shock. 30 turns, you'll lose another 350. So you're going to need to make about 1,000 or so food up, production up by turn 30 or 31. Little things that I forgot to mention earlier in the game. Or the guide, I should say. And I think that's everything. So build up your armies, take out Corinth, take the rest of Achaea and Lacona, and go nuts. Just remembering, most of your attacks are going to be on Cytheria. These islands guys over here tend to be rather aggressive. These guys less aggressive, but still worth conquering or vassalizing at some point. But if you control the southern part of Greece, Achaea and Lacona, as well as maybe some islands, Crete or something, go crush the Trojans, and at which point then you can vassalize everybody or conquer them if they don't submit. Anyway, that will be it from me. Thank you guys all for watching. I know this was long and there was a lot of stuff here. It's a very complex faction, especially when you choose to go for 10 or less units. Stacking those bonuses is very powerful, takes specific focus. Honestly, though, if you don't want that challenge, just ignore it, play them normally, and you won't notice a huge difference. Check out my other guides in this playlist. Leave a comment. Leave what you think is a great tip, what units you use. If you've got a better starting turn or 2 moves, by all means, put it in the comments. People would love to read it. Thank you guys all for watching. Bye for now.